All right, let me just read down your list and see if I have this right. You've worked in the technology channel for over 20 years. You founded and ran a successful MSP business focusing on secure Wi-Fi for 15 years, deployed over 1,000 large-scale wireless networks across the US, Mexico, Canada, and the Caribbean, was part of the Aruba Advisory Council, started building software to support the customer experience in 2015, purchased a performance monitoring software company, built a network as a service program with Wells Fargo, sold his MSP business in 2021, recently raised a Series A round of funding led by Bellini Capital. He's the founder and chief product officer at TechGrid. Welcome, my friend, Philip Wegner.
Thanks, Danny. Good to be here.
Did I get all that right?
Yes.
I'm sure I missed a few things.
I had kids along the way, some other things, but yes, that's correct.
That's basically it. So
Yeah.
We've worked together for a long time.
We have.
Nearly 11 years now. So I know the journey pretty well from a firsthand experience. I'm sure there's a lot of details there that I'm not in the know on.
Sure.
Just from doing business, but many people I think would be interested to know your journey in tech, and I think they get a lot of a benefit out of that from hearing your lessons on the wins and losses, the insights that you have from running an MSP and now into a software company, right? And that transformation. And so that's sort of the point of the conversation today. So I just want to take you through your journey in tech, right? And see where that goes.
Great.
Have you always been interested in technology?
I would say yeah, but I didn't know a lot about technology, and I grew up in an environment where my father was a minister. And then when I went to college, I didn't really think about technology. I thought more about what my parents knew, which was youth ministry and things like that. So I actually studied youth ministry in college. And then if you study things like that, you don't really have a lot of options coming out of school. I think a lot of people, they go to school for one thing, they end up in another field. And my first job that I could get out of college was basically in sales for a technology company, and it was for a telco. And so I started my first job selling cell phones and phone systems and things like that for a small telco.
So you really it's just basically your first job.
It was my first job. Yeah, no, I didn't, I wasn't planning on doing that. It was just the first job that I could get.
So out of the telco, how did you end up at did you end up at a VAR or an MSP somehow after that, or?
Well, in those days, there were a lot of companies that were trying to sell competitive local exchange carriers, which is a term that people don't use as much anymore. But basically, it was a small telecom provider that was selling phone systems, cellular phones, and things like that. And once I got into that company, I just started learning technology, and then I ended up moving from that company to AT&T, which is obviously the biggest telco. And I just learned a lot about technology. And I learned very quickly that technology enables businesses to do things. And so I really I enjoyed learning all the different ways that technology can enable businesses. And one of and there's a lot of disadvantages of being in a big company like an AT&T that I probably make fun of now, but there's a lot of great things that I learned at that company because they had very good technology training programs and how things work, and I really, really got into all that kind of stuff. So every job I kind of had, I would go in and then learn everything I could about it, and then ended up moving into other roles at other companies where I just learned a different angle on the industry. But it's funny to think about my journey, not even having a technology background, in college.
Yeah, and I mean, like a lot of people, like you said, sometimes you just fall into it.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily what you thought it was going to be, but then you get into it and you like it.
I think there's a really important learning curve that anybody should have in their kind of career. I think when they get started, you don't know what you're going to do, you don't know what you're going to like, but you need to learn as much as you possibly can. And a lot of people are 30 years old and don't know what they want to do necessarily, and that's totally normal. But what's really important is that you learn as much as you can about the role that you're in, and then you can kind of direct your career. And so what happened when I got started is I would learn something, and I'd be at a company, and I learned as much as I can, and then I figured out, hey, I don't really like this. I want to do this is the piece of technology that I really like, and I want to move into that. And so I started in telecom, and then I ended up working for a couple startups and learning managed services and outsourcing and data center and all that.
What year thereabouts was around.
That's none of your business. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's early. This is early 2000s.
Okay.
So yeah, I've been in the industry for 20 plus years. This is early 2000, 2003, time frame.
And what was what were people doing?
Well, back then, you remember, I don't know, the dot-com boom and bust, like, was the 2000s to 2003-ish time frame. And there were a lot of startups around IT outsourcing and unified communications and data center. Back then, it was mostly like a hybrid cloud or a colo type facility. And I worked for a couple of those startups. And it was just a very good learning experience seeing inside these companies. I actually was at 2 or 3 companies that either didn't make it or ended up being merged in with other businesses. But what I was able to see is how they built products, how they thought about things. I was working directly with like a VP of sales, where I was literally watching him write our catalog that we were selling and make up part numbers in a spreadsheet. And I was like, oh, there's a human that does that. Like if sometimes after you're a big company, you don't know that a lot of these things are being created, but somebody is coming up with what the product is. What are we going to sell? How is it going to be packaged together? And so I was able to see a lot of those things inside a couple of those startups. So even though some of them made it, some of them didn't, that I was at for that period of time, I was able to experience a lot of that from the inside.
So when did the idea of starting your own, reseller business come about?
Yep.
And I guess the question there is, when did that idea come about? And then why didn't you just potentially continue to work for another company that rise the ranks as opposed to?
Well, so when I started in telco, and then I ended up in like a more of a wiring and phone systems kind of business. And in that business, we were essentially selling, wired connections. And what I thought is, and this is when, if you remember back this far, this is when Wi-Fi was innovative, if you remember that. And we were going around saying, you don't have to plug in anymore. Your laptop was still really big, but it was connected wirelessly.
I'm of the age to still remember the dial-up sound, right?
Yeah. Well, it was so, and we were going in, and I saw this like, hey, wireless is going to be the trend. And the problem back then with wireless is people were scared of it because I have a wireless connection, not plugged into a wire. And so I thought the opportunity was going to be wireless and security, because I have to go in and sell wireless infrastructure, and then I have to be able to provide security around that. You can't really segment those things anymore. It's really got to be all integrated together, and that's really where the idea behind Secure Edge came from. It was that we were going to build these big networks, and that's really what happened. The industry transitioned into primarily mobile first, architecture. Back when it was, I thought it was innovative. We were getting 54 meg. Which means we're really getting 28, whatever throughput. Now we have gigabit speeds and all that. Exactly. It was innovative back then.
Did you always have an entrepreneurial mindset? And like, is that,
actually,
starting
yes.
a business is that's not for everybody.
What's interesting is that I did. So I'll unpack that a little. So my dad was a minister, and so I grew up in the kind of that environment. And what I remember about being in my dad's church is, number one, we were broke. But number two, the people that had control were the people that donated money. And so there were people that had essentially control over my father that really were just writing big checks. And I remember back then thinking that was kind of out of whack. But that's just the reality is the funding really controls a lot of ministry and things like that. And so when in my early 20s, I met some folks who were Christian businessmen, and I saw like what they were doing with funds. And I was like, oh, well, if you can be in a business and be successful and make a big impact, like that's what I want to do. Like I think that's where you can make the biggest impact. And so I thought at that point, I decided, hey, I should be a Christian entrepreneur. Like that's what I should be doing. And so, I started reading books when I was early 20s, 19 maybe, about entrepreneurship, how to start a business. I'm reading books about how to set up an LLC,
Right.
all these things. So yes, I had the entrepreneurial kind of mindset very early on.
So what were the early days like for Secure Edge, the MSP? What was the first few years? Obviously getting off the ground, starting to get your foot in the door, your first sales.
Yeah.
What was it like? What were the systems you guys were using?
Yep.
Like, how were you guys operating?
Well, when we started, it was just me, an engineer, and a technician, and you know them because they're still here. And I was primarily selling, and we were installing and fulfilling, and it was really awful. We had not a lot of systems. We essentially had, an accounting system, and we were smart enough to set up a CRM and things like that and start functioning that way. But bootstrapping a company is very stressful. And literally, I was selling enough in gross profit and in revenue to cover payroll literally every month for years and years and years. And so I just got used to going in, working with customers, scoping out a project, taking that gross profit and, paying employees. And that's how we got started. It was completely bootstrapped.
Do you think that that's still pretty common for smaller resellers and MSPs today?
I think a lot of resellers and MSPs are very good lifestyle businesses, and you can build a really successful business and take care of family, and take care of a lot of families that work for your company, and that's what we were able to do. It was a good business.
Do you think it would have been easier today if you were starting it?
I think it's a little bit easier today to know the roadmap, but it's also more competitive.
Okay.
So I do think that the MSP space is very competitive, and so you have to have differentiation and things like that. Back then, there weren't as many, and so if you were going in there and talking about wireless, which is what we did, we specialized in a specific technology. We were going in as experts, and there were only a handful of companies that could do exactly what we could do, and that was a really competitive advantage. I think that the companies still have to do that. What is my competitive advantage? What's my go-to-market strategy? What can I do that's different than the MSP down the road? Because if you go into any given major city, there might be 20 MSPs,
Right.
way more than that, in a major city. So,
well, and you talked about, you had the foresight, at least at the time, to get a CRM, which this was probably security started in 2006. So we're talking about mid to late 2000s. CRM is probably pretty.
Salesforce.
Well, you have Salesforce,
Yeah.
but and they're around.
Yep.
But spreadsheets are still probably super common. They're common today, but I just find it's interesting to me that, we always talk about you're an early adopter of HubSpot.
Right.
Which, you started on Salesforce probably at the time, but then you're an early adopter to HubSpot.
Yep.
SEO.
Yep.
Inbound, digital marketing. This is mid to late 2000s. That was kind of against traditional convention for a reseller or an MSP in that space. And my question is, have you always had this sort of natural rebellious sort of mindset on your approach to problem solving or the needs of the business?
You could argue that it might be rebellious against what other people are doing, but I definitely look for problems and look for the right way to solve them. And that to me, that's just really obvious that that's what you should do. And we did that early on. So in the HubSpot example, yeah, we were early adopters of HubSpot, probably too early. There's advantages to having. If you're a leader in a business, you should be some sort of visionary, right? And so you should be able to see kind of the roadmap, what your company is doing, and you should be able to see problems and then come up with solutions to the problems. So sometimes you can be really early, and that's the problem with being a visionary is you might see things 5 or 10 years before. The guys that thought of Uber, there was actually people that were doing patents before we had smartphones.
Right.
They were just early. They had a great idea, but they were too early, and that definitely can happen. And that certainly happened with us a few times where I thought, hey, this is gonna happen tomorrow, and it turned out to be a 3 to 5 year kind of horizon when it was actually gonna happen. And with HubSpot, the example there was we were looking for leads. We had to generate leads. How are we gonna grow the company? And stumbled onto a lot of the inbound methodology and things like that, which back then was innovative. Now it's not. And so we really did dive into that and start driving leads that way.
It was so early that I think you said that Brian Halligan gave you a tour of the office.
Yeah, so this is really off track, but what is really cool to watch HubSpot as an example is I remember we were on calls with HubSpot, and they were like, "Hey, we're having this first conference," and the first conference they had was at a community college, and we're going to the community college and then listening to their reference accounts being just random small businesses,
right?
Mystery dinner type things where they're just random things, and then watching them go from that to tens of thousands of people or 10,000 plus at conferences and grow is really cool. And then, yeah, the first conference that I was at, Halligan gave us the CEO, now the chairman or the board, gave us a tour of their small office in Boston. It was pretty cool.
Right. And that's just a cool, it'll come into play later
Yeah.
in the story, but it's cool to see
Yeah.
what was a young software company then, and obviously they've had a great story, in their rise, but like, it's kind of coming full circle a little bit now that you're in the software space, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
But that's really interesting. So you're growing the business, you're a reseller. At what point was it, okay, we should start offering managed services?
Yeah. Well, I think the natural progression is you're selling something, and for us, we were selling these secure networks, and then the progression is you're selling it for your customer, and for us, we would go back to the customer, or they would say, "Hey, we're having a problem with our network," and we're like, "Well, did you update the code on the?" Yeah, there's a patch that would fix that. Did you update the code on the controller? And they were like, "No, we didn't update the code." And then we'd go in there and we'd look, and so at the time, we would go and set up the configuration, and then we'd just be like, "Okay, call us if you need us." And then we go back in, 18 months later, the code had never been updated. There's security patches that would fix problems. And then so it became really abundantly obvious that we had to have some sort of support contract for the customers and just handle that for them because they didn't have time to do that. And that's really how our managed service business started, is that we needed to keep our customers up to date, and they were asking us for that. That's how we kind of got going in that.
So it's really just the demands of the customer.
Demand of the customer, absolutely. And we had to keep them secure. Like we're going in saying, "Hey, your network's secure." Well, if you don't update the software, then you're not. And then there's features that you're missing out on if you don't keep the code up to date. So,
but we talk about even today, where resellers, at least some of them, are sort of apprehensive about moving more into services, and vice versa. MSPs that are highly focused on services don't necessarily want to move into the selling gear.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting in the market is you had like this VAR community, the value-added reseller community, and they started 40 plus years ago selling, and they make a lot of money reselling hardware and then trying to add in professional services. Then on the other side, kind of the spectrum, you had the managed services community, and a lot of managed service providers will literally say, "We don't care about the hardware. We just want to support it. So you can buy whatever you want." And neither one of those strategies are exactly correct. If you're a VAR and you don't want to earn money on managed services, you're leaving a tremendous amount of money on the table. You should be going in and selling recurring revenue, and the value of your company is driven based on that recurring revenue. And if you're an MSP and you're not selling the equipment and the project and the installation, like, you're leaving a lot of money on the table. Why would you not do that? And then the biggest kind of thing that's bringing these kind of two worlds together is the customers are demanding it. Like, they don't want to go buy their gear online and then go have somebody else support their gear. They want a solution. Like, and more, I just want to buy a network. I just want to buy communications. I just want to buy, a system for my conference room, and I want it to always work. And so there's this trend towards technology is becoming a utility, or like power, if you will. And that's here. That trend is here. It started with AWS 20 years ago now, right? And so the whole community has to realize that these things are merging together. It's the customer wants to buy a solution, which means you must provide that solution as a reseller, if you will, and as a managed service provider to bring that all together.
And so back in the day, we would have been providing the Wi-Fi and maybe some services to go along with that. But then that customer might have how many other vendors providing maybe data center or these other solutions that they need. And so the customer back then would have multiple different vendors for all kinds of things, right?
Yeah, and I don't think that necessarily goes away because this concept of like, hey, a one-stop shop is difficult. Some of the larger IT outsourcers, I think, are going to follow that model. I still think but I do think that like an MSP or a VAR has to look at what are the solution categories that we can realistically provide. So let's take AWS as an example. AWS started with just a handful of products like storage and compute, and now they've grown to 200 different cloud services that they provide over AWS. And if you look at a VAR or an MSP, and again, we're saying that these are merging into just a technology service provider. It's, hey, we just provide it, You still have to look at what you can provide realistically and take each one of those kind of solution categories. Like you may or may not want to do audio video. Like You may or may not want to do physical security. Maybe you're just doing networking and cloud. Maybe that's where you're going to focus in security. So you still have to look at your skill set and figure out what can I realistically provide to my customer.
Right. One interesting thing that I want to get your opinion on, when we were Secure Edge, we were doing projects all over the country, and obviously then into some other neighboring countries.
Yeah.
Like typically a lot of service providers, especially since we were more of a specialty shop, weren't huge by any in terms of like, workforce.
Yep.
How are we able to do that? Because usually we're limited to, you're maybe a region, neighboring states or so, but like.
Well, the answer is you use partnerships. So if you're focused, let's say on networking like we were able to create essentially a network of partners. And so when someone said, hey, I want you to deploy in California, well, we would use a partner to deploy the physical infrastructure, and then we were the engineering resources that exist on top of that. The advantage of building solution segments in your business, if you will, hey, I'm going to sell, networking, I'm going to do UCaaS or whatever, is you can think about the entire life cycle of that service. Mm-hmm. And obviously the company is called TechGrid. And so we're talking about utility-based offerings. Like we're saying that if you're going to provide it, it needs to work like a utility. And you wouldn't imagine calling the power company and then not having somebody to send out to your location.
Right.
Right. And so you've got to think about the things you're providing, and do I have the ability to provide the entire life cycle of the service? The entire life cycle is typically some sort of assessment and design, some sort of physical installation or field services, if you will, the professional services to configure it and actually get that system set up, and then the managed services. So if somebody calls, it has a problem keeping it up to date and having that kind of support, or that technical network operations center is part of that. And that kind of rounds out the servicing wheel, if you think about this as kind of a life cycle. And we're able to take networking and figure out how to do all that, and then be able to package it and sell it to our customers essentially on a subscription.
And it wasn't perfect back at that time. I mean, like, I don't think it's still, I still think that there's some figuring out that needs to do around activating partnerships,
right,
for the MSP or VAR, because it wasn't exactly perfect.
Well, I think what people need to understand is that if you go and work with a big brand like the IBMs of the world and the AT&Ts of the world, all the 3-digit,
Right.
people that agencies that you know about, or agencies or whatever, companies you know about, they have networks of partners. Like you can be, AT&T has hundreds just in the US of integration partners. And so you're working with essentially a brand, and then behind that brand, there's a network of people working on their behalf. And I think that type of functionality needs to exist for the MSP community, where they can show up and then maybe connect to somebody in California, even though they have an office in New York. And then to the customer, which is the most important, that interaction needs to be entirely seamless. They need to look at, hey, this is my MSP in New York that I'm working with, and that subcontractor or partnership, if you will, is literally working on behalf. And so it just looks like the one brand to the customer. And you think about how in the connected world, I'm talking about systems like Uber and Postmates and Instacart and all these different systems, they're basically just networks of people or companies or contractors working together to solve a specific problem. And what's so interesting about the MSP community is we have all these companies that literally sell networking for a living. But there hasn't been a way to kind of connect people together loosely coupled, so that if I'm in New York and I want to work with a company out of California, I can do that seamlessly. And so I think there's a big opportunity for us to solve that.
Right. And that kind of gets into the next portion, which is, all right, we're an MSP, you're running Secure Edge, we're growing, you're doing projects, things are going pretty well.
Yeah.
And then there comes a decision, why did you start to build software?
Yeah.
Like where does, I don't think it's necessarily a natural, maybe it is for some, but I just feel like for a lot of MSPs or resellers, if business is going well the way it is, to me it seems like a little bit left field of, well, let's go build some software now, right?
Well, so first of all, there's a very different world of being, let's say, a network integrator or VAR MSP and building software. And so it's really easy to go waste hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars building software as an MSP or VAR because it's a completely different skill set. But what you'll see with a lot of the larger VARs and MSPs is they're investing in software primarily to solve the customer experience problem. And that is that, hey, my customer has this expectation of what their experience is going to be like doing business with me. And I know that I have to make it easy for them to operate and do business with my MSP. And so that's why we started investing in software.
Well, why not just go buy some software that already exists or some apps, right, to do whatever you're trying to do?
Well, first of all, at the time, several years ago, there wasn't software like that existed. So,
So that's more of a new problem.
That was problem number one. But problem number two is, even if there was software that could be on the front end, there were things that we wanted to do that existing software just did not do. So an example is, or just the use case here was, AWS was really ramping up at the time. And if you think about AWS, it's not selling product. Amazon's selling toilet paper and products. AWS is not. AWS is selling a solution to a problem. And that solution that they're selling is a bunch of different stuff packaged together. It's essentially the services lifecycle with a data center. And then they were able to take a data center and slice it into individual services and say, I'm going to sell you compute. And I'm going to calculate it in a way that the server companies weren't doing at the time. That was completely different. And so when we started building software, the problem that we're trying to solve is, how could we sell a network and deliver it effectively on subscription in a similar way? Obviously, it's a fixed rate or ish, different than AWS, but how could we deliver this thing essentially on subscription? And then if we did deliver it on subscription, what would the customer expect to see? It wouldn't be logging in and buying an access point. That doesn't make any sense. Like, it'd be more like a service interface, more like an AWS style interface. And so when we started investing in software, we were simply an MSP trying to build that services kind of interface. And to do that, we had to be able to package solutions and sell it the same way that AWS was trying to do. And so that's why we started building software. It was really to invest in our customers' experience in a way that we didn't feel like anybody had done before.
And you had tried to use what was available at the time.
Well, we actually built our own interface, and then we tried to plug it into existing industry software. And so we were trying to essentially use the existing industry plumbing, if you will, and then put some sort of modern, interface on the front of it.
So talk about that relationship,
Yeah.
though, because I think that's a bigger concept. Is there's a back end and a front end.
Yeah.
Talk about that relationship.
If you showed up and said, hey, I want to build I've got a house today and I would like you to build me a 70-story building, but I want to use the foundation from my existing house. You'd be like, that doesn't make any sense, right? And if you look at the industry, you'd be like, hey, I gotta blow away your foundation. I gotta dig, stories down to go stories up and rebuild the foundation. If you look at the IT industry and where it came from and what it was for, it started more than 45 years ago now, and it was designed to sell product only. And back then, a product was just a box, literally with everything in it. And so it was designed to move that. And so you look at a lot of the big distributors, you look at a lot of the companies and the software that existed, it was designed to essentially push boxes. That's really what we did back then, or what the channel did back then. I wasn't around back then, but the channel was around back then.
Right.
Now, as the channel evolved, you ended up with hardware and you ended up with licensing. And that was the first kind of like broke the system. How do I track all licenses? And then I added services because customer wanted services. Then we added apps. Then we added internet. And all that is their own essentially systems running on the back end. And to make it even worse, the customer's saying, I don't even want to use visual components anymore. I want to buy all of it. And I want you to give it to me as a utility. And so like the systems that are designed in the industry, that's essentially the plumbing, are entirely broken when you look at how the customers want to consume. This is why AWS came out of nowhere and was able to disrupt the entire industry because they built these back-end systems that were able to essentially revolutionize how people could consume on the front end. And that functionality does not exist for almost all the VARs and all the MSPs in the channel. And so what you end up with is you go and say, hey, Mr. MSP, what's your customer experience look like? And they're like, well, I've got a support portal, and then I've got an invoicing portal, and then I've got maybe I have messaging, maybe I don't, most of them don't. And these things are all just literally fragmented systems where they put a front end on one thing or the other. And so some of them are really good at selling hardware as an example, but they have no service interface. Some of them can do services because they built something on top of the PSA, but they can't do
So the customer has to log into like multiple,
yes.
if they log in at all.
If the customer logs in at all, because the customer is most likely to not log in to your piece of shit, 6 portals, right? They're not going to do that, right? They're going to go, what is this crap? So what's so funny is there's this just complete disconnect between what does a customer want versus what the channel has the capability to deliver. And what the customer wants is what I get everywhere else. I order my toilet paper. I know in a 2-hour window it's going to show up to my house. I haven't finished all my Christmas shopping yet, but I can get it all by Sunday, right? All that stuff, that's what they expect. I order a sandwich and I can literally watch the car drive to my house, okay? Meanwhile, the technology industry that is selling technology for a living, that is providing all the connective tools to Amazon and all these different companies, doesn't have its own infrastructure connected. And so I can go order $1 million in infrastructure from a $200 million VAR or MSP, and they can't even tell me where my tracking is on my pallets of stuff. It's just absolutely, it's hilarious.
And the infrastructure exists though. I mean, APIs have been around. So why isn't more stuff connected?
Well, I would argue that actually a lot of the APIs, so if you look at the industry, and this is a pet peeve of mine, the industry's been selling networking and all these things, and we were really good at focusing on the APIs that were centered around product. And so if I want to integrate with firewall, with a switch or whatever, generally I can connect those things together in some sort of management console, whatever. Specific it's with one brand, but certainly even across brands. And so really the focus has been on that product integration, right? When I'm going out to the site, I can integrate all this crap together. And that's really, really good and necessary. What was missed by everyone is, what about the integration of the business side? What about how I provide the network? What about integrating all of that? Like even support renewals and all that stuff. There's not even APIs for a lot of these things yet. They're just building that. And so what the IT channel is doing, and a lot of the big distributors have really just gotten all over this, which is really, really great for everybody, is they're building essentially what their own platform, and it's a distribution platform. And they're turning on all these things as services on APIs. But this isn't something that's been around for 20 years. This is relatively new, where they're turning on a lot of these things. Now, they existed for the really big VARs, but that functionality has to exist essentially for everybody else in the industry.
And so these disconnected systems that obviously we had to deal with the same thing. We ended up building our own software.
Yeah.
And just to kind of unpack the problem and what that was doing.
Yeah.
Like what was it doing to our sales process?
Yeah.
Like how long did it take us to build quotes and then respond and make changes? And
yeah,
because I think some of the disconnection it really hits the day to day.
Yeah. So if you really take if you look at running an MSP or VAR, if you look at running the business and you go, what's the source of the work? Like what's taking us so long? And you get into a process like sales quoting. And you get into it and you start mapping it out and you start just marking all the things that are manual. Oh, I got to go to the distributor or the partner and get a quote. What format are they sending that to me? Oh, they're sending it to me in PDF. Okay. Well, that means that my team has to take the PDF, look at it with your eyes, and hand key it into your quoting system if you have that. But a lot of times the quoting system is a spreadsheet. And then the spreadsheet gets sent to the customer in some sort of quoting format. And then the customer sends a PO. And what format is that in? Oh, that's in a PDF from the customer. And then that PDF is getting forwarded. And it's just like this manual crap, place to place. And so the source of a lot of the work is actually all the manual entry between all these different systems, which is it's insanity. that these things aren't connected together. Why am I not directly connected with my partner? And so because they're using Salesforce, why wouldn't I just directly connect and get my pricing in real time? And then why wouldn't I be able to provide it to my customer in real time? And so we've got to invest in what I call this API infrastructure around the business of running these companies. And what we have to do is we have to say, what are we required to provide the customer? And that's really, really important. If we don't solve this problem, we're all going to get our asses handed to us. So it's really important that we solve this problem because Amazon's going to if we don't. This is the reality. So we have to look at what does the customer need and require, and then we have to go all the way back through all the manual workflows and say each one of these things must be a microservice that's turned on that digitizes what the customer wants to do on the front end. So when they want to buy something, that entire process must be digitized. When they want support, that entire process must be digitized.
And so you famously have said multiple times, and even in this conversation, that the customer doesn't really care about the specs anymore. It was probably fine, but since we've gotten accustomed to certain experiences in our personal life, whether it's Instacart, Uber, all these other things, Amazon, they just don't care about the specs. They just want it to work.
Yeah.
Explain to me how the customer has changed.
Yeah. So there's a book I read a long time ago just about like the technology wheel, if you will. And what happens is we get an iPhone and it's amazing and it's a luxury to have an iPhone. Well, that was more than 10 years ago. I don't even know when, what are we on, iPhone 15 now?
I was going to say, we're coming up on 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. So after you have this piece of technology, you start building your life around this technology, and then it becomes essentially a utility. That's what happens. And cloud has become a utility. Our phones have become a utility. Our networks have become a utility. And that's just the life cycle of technology. Once I use it, when we were building networks, 15 years ago or now, it was innovative and it was a nice to have. And so the customer was really operating on the wired network, and then the wireless network was an amenity. Those days are gone. The wireless network is running their point of sale, and the wireless network is running their company. And so if that network goes down, the entire business is down. And that's come true with our phones that are in our pockets. That's come true with all the networks that we're using, with our computers. If I lost my computer, what would I do?
Right.
The company, we'd be down.
Off today.
Exactly. I don't even know what I would do all day. And so that's just the nature of technology.
And is that really what spurred then, how do we do as a service?
If a customer's mindset is, I just need to consume it as a utility, or I just want this solution to work, then that's where the utility-based model makes sense. And more, if you went into a small business that might have not even a lot of employees, they still need to have a network in place. And the consumption model in that environment is much best to consume it monthly. That's why when we buy internet to our buildings, we just pay a monthly fee for it. I think that same type scenario is going to apply to essentially everything inside buildings. Now, I'm not the one that thinks this. A lot of the industry geeks think this as well.
But it's been kind of a problem for a lot of VARs and MSPs to actually do it.
Yeah. So if you listen to the industry geeks, and I'm an industry geek and I listen to the industry geeks, they say that 75% of infrastructure that goes into buildings like this one are going to be consumed in some sort of as a service model. They've been saying this for several years. Now, 75% of infrastructure in buildings is not currently consumed that way. And their question is, well, why is it not? Well, because the technology companies, which is where almost 75%, it's somewhere between 70 and 75% of all the technology is sold into businesses, don't have the capability to deliver it effectively as a service. And so if you solve that problem, I do believe that, and that was our experience when we had a service provider, that if you offer it to a customer, they will usually choose the subscription-based model.
You talk about flipping the subscription model.
Yeah.
Right? What do you mean by that? In terms of flipping it like a car dealership? Like, can you go into that in terms of what that means? Because I think you've said that's really what could be game changing if people would.
Well, yeah. So
understand.
I mean, just conceptually, 85% of cars and homes are, I don't know the exact statistic, are essentially financed. And so when you go into a car dealership or you're going to buy your house, you're usually looking at, how much house can I afford? And you don't mean how much can I pay cash for? You mean, what am I paying monthly for, right?
Right.
I need to put some down or whatever. So just conceptually, if we were selling essentially as a service, the price tag and the value or the essentially that the customer could receive would be much higher. So if I had to pay cash for my car versus financing, I'm going to buy less car. Same thing is true about technology. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is that a lot of the customers are already financing technology and buying it essentially that way. They're just doing it through a commercial line or something like that. And what we're advocating is when you're putting infrastructure in a building, and the reason that AWS hasn't solved this problem yet is because if you do the infrastructure in a building, somebody has to finance that. Somebody has to buy it and then finance that. That's very complicated. What that means is that technology finance needs to be embedded into the essentially sales stack, if you will, of the VAR and the MSP, so they can easily flip between subscription-based models and charging the customer up front. And just gives them that flexibility to essentially sell everything bundled together and as a service. And what we're saying is if you can bundle those things together, in the car dealership kind of example, well, you can include a service contract, you can include, updates to it, you can include free oil changes if you're not driving an electric car or whatever. And so if you put that into the MSP and VAR, it unlocks all sorts of other revenue opportunity. And the other thing I want to point out too, from our own experience is, we could sell a lot more, and you're selling in a blended margin type scenario where you're not competing necessarily for, a hardware margin or service margin. It's just blended together. And so the customer doesn't have as much kind of control, if you will, over the transaction because, hey, it's going to be $10,000 a month. And that's really, I think, where the industry is headed and the average of our MSP needs to get to.
And about when did Secure Edge start selling network as a service?
We started selling it around 2016 is when we started going in to customers. And we realized very quickly that we were going to run out of money if we kept going in that model because
you were funding it.
Because we were self-funding.
Okay.
So we were going to customers and customers were like, yeah, we love the subscription model. We're like, well, we're going to get that money from.
Right.
So we weren't big enough to fund a lot of the larger transactions. So I could go in and fund a small transaction, but I could see very quickly that the more successful we were, if we were going to be our own bank, the more capital I needed to raise for the bank.
Also extremely risky if a customer decides to...
Exactly. That's the other part of it is like what if a customer can't pay their bill? What are we going to do? And so there was that whole there's a trend where you go into an MSP of R and they want to be their own bank. Now there's some scenarios where that makes sense if they're sitting on a lot of cash and they want to do that. But there's actually a lot of logistics that's involved in being your own bank that you have to be aware of. The first thing is, if your team is really successful, you're going to have to raise more capital. That's just the reality. So, you have to think about how much can I scale before I have to raise money. And do you want to go raise money just to buy technology and put it in buildings? Do you want to handle the credit risk? If your customer fails, that's a little bit intimidating, on some of these larger transactions. And then there's a lot of other really details that are super important. How do you handle taxation and things like that? And if you start putting out a lot of equipment at customers' locations, have personal property tax and things like that have to be filed on these locations. There's so much logistics that's involved. And so what we decided to do is instead of trying to become the own bank, the really big unlock for us was getting linked up with a technology finance program. And once we were able to connect with Wells Fargo and some of these other technology finance programs, that really enabled us to figure out how to package these things without carrying all that liability and the tax burden and things like that.
Right. And customers were very receptive when you pitched it to them.
Yeah. So we had this debate internally. Right? You work here. We like to debate.
Sure.
And the debate internally was if we went into companies that are traditional, and I'm talking about insurance companies and companies that maybe had a lot of capital. Would they even consider a consumption model when we were pitching it to them? They're used to buying $1 million in infrastructure and then paying $150,000 to $200,000 a year to maintain that infrastructure. If we go in and pitch them, completely subscription-based model, would they even entertain it? And we were pleasantly surprised that they were not only open to it, but that they actually wanted to do that. And that really shocked me in a couple of the deals that we were able to process, where we were presenting the essentially as a service option, and they would say, "Hey, we consume AWS on a utility-based model. We consume Microsoft on subscription, essentially being billed monthly for our Microsoft licenses. Why wouldn't we consume a network or a communication system? Why would we do that essentially as a service?" And so it was very, very receptive. And matter of fact, when we led with the subscription model, what we found is that we ended up selling some sort of subscription component 80% of the time. So even if we went in with, hey, it's network as a service, and they were like, hey, we have capital, we want to buy some of that, they ended up with the managed services contract. And so it ended up growing our services revenue dramatically when we started leading with the as a service model.
Was it hard for the sales team to wrap their head around it and kind of understand how to sell it, essentially? Going from a product or maybe a service, but now this is sort of something new.
I 100% believe that one of the biggest hurdles that specifically a VAR is going to have, an MSP is going to have an advantage here, but a VAR that isn't used to selling recurring items has got some hurdles to essentially either retrain their sales team or bring in folks that are used to essentially selling as a service or on subscription. And we certainly experienced that, because for so many years we were making money selling a partner's stuff. Hey, this is look at this firewall, look at all the stuff it can do and all the services we can turn on, and we're the best engineering firm to configure this firewall. That's how we would go in and effectively pitch. Now we're going in and saying, hey, we're going to sell you this whole thing as a service. Yeah, you're getting this great stack from this partner that we're including, but we're wrapping it all together in this subscription model, and you don't have to manage any of this. We're going to give you a report on what's happening from your security infrastructure, and it's all going to be maintained and all going to be kept up to date. It was a different kind of sales motion, if you will, and we definitely had to retrain our sales team on how to do that.
Did it change? How was it in terms of like comp plans and,
Yes.
Because obviously I know we're getting into the details of it.
Yeah.
At a high level, going from product-based or maybe even just services, there's a lot of ways to comp, your sales team.
Yeah, there's a lot of models that came from essentially the telco industries and the SaaS industries that I think a lot of MSPs and VARs should consider taking a look at. And when you're a VAR and MSP, which is what we would recommend, being an as-a-service provider, you've got one-time revenue that comes in with gross profit, and then you've got recurring revenue. And we could do a whole session on designing comp plans around that, but you really want to drive recurring revenue from your sales team and then keep them hungry to go get more. And so the way that we compensated employees is a percentage of gross profit, because that's how the company was living, and then also as a variable based on how much recurring revenue they sold, and that was essentially driving the value of the company. And so there's a whole discussion to be had around designing your comp plan. And so, but it's very important to think about, if I've got a comp plan that was designed 20 years ago, right, does it still align with the current company goals of driving recurring revenue?
So let me come back to the timeline a little bit, because we're as a service, as we're moving into it as our as Secure Edge. We started in 2016. 17, 18, what does the software we're building look like at that time?
It was mostly just a front end with existing industry software on the back end. And so the embarrassing side of the story is we actually built a front end and then we're never able to use it. We tried to build this interface, and we imagined essentially a service provider interface. So we looked at telco interfaces, we looked at AWS, we looked at modern experiences from Amazon and Azure and things like that. And we said, what does the customer expect? And then we essentially built a UI with that. And then, but when you think about what we're doing in the IT industry, we're actually workflow oriented. So if you think about let's say you want to sell a solution. Well, if I'm going to sell a network, I've got to design firewalls, switches, access points, and there's a whole workflow around just the design of that. And then there's a workflow around how do I go get my costs for that? Because I got to go negotiate with a partner or whatever. And so on the back end of this kind of front end, you've got workflows that have to kind of take place on the back end in order to deliver anything on the front end. And what we did originally is we said our workflow software is going to be our CRM, and it's going to be PSA software. And we tried all the industry leaders in PSA software, and we're going to put this front end on top of that. And what we envisioned is when we're working with a customer and they're buying, let's say, a solution, and we're deploying a network, what is that experience going to look like? And so we thought about, well, when I order Domino's, I have a tracker. And so we need to build a pizza tracker. We need to build a tracking mechanism like that. And so we built that kind of across the interface. And then we tried to align that with what was happening on all this kind of infrastructure in the back end. And we completely failed. Like we designed the workflows, we built in workflow charts. We're like, we're going to use our PSA software, we're going to run through it, and we're going to try to use that to update the interface for the customer. And we just could not do it. And the thing looking at it, it wasn't that we were trying to do anything that the customer shouldn't expect. It's that the infrastructure we're using on the back end just wasn't designed to do that. It was designed around selling services, for example, as PSA, or the CRM was really designed around managing customer opportunities. It just wasn't designed to do all the things that the customer was expecting.
This was the famous conversation around the realization of, I believe it was John, who we worked with.
Poor guy.
Who came to you and said, we're going to have to build
so
this stuff on the back that
we
were trying not to.
So we're spending a lot of money building software, and we're trying to build it on top of existing industry software, PSA and CRM. And I have a guy that was working on that product, and he came to me and he said, he's still with us, obviously. He came to me and he said, there's no way that we can do it. And so in effect, what we had done is we had said, we're going to build a front end, but we're not going to build the back end because that's too big. It's impossible. We're not going to do that. And he was like, dude, we are going to have to build the back end. There's no way we can build the experience that we're looking to build on this existing back end infrastructure. And I said, I'm trying to say what I could say. I said, don't ever say anything as dumb as that. I was like, that is the stupidest idea I've ever heard of. That's impossible. And we would be freaking idiots to even attempt it. Like that's literally how strong I was coming out against it. And I was right that it is stupid. It was stupid.
2019?
Yeah, this is 2019 going into 2020. Right. And we were like, and when he came to me, this is actually the end of 2019, early 2020. It's like we've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars at the time.
4 years at this point.
We've been putting all this money into it, and we're failing. And there's no way we're going to be able to build this nice front end without essentially fixing all the back end infrastructure.
Which essentially leads me up to 2020,
right?
Which is actually just it's very serendipitous, really. Of okay, so we hit 2020, COVID hits. And, the business, like a lot of businesses, things change.
Yeah.
And it gets pretty dicey in terms of just, the world. Everything shuts down. We're in a pandemic. Talk to me about that moment, because you mentioned to me before that was kind of a crossroads moment that you had in the early days of COVID and the pandemic.
Yeah.
And talk to me about that moment.
Well, so for context, in 2019, we had figured out the as-a-service business model. And so we were able to do it, but it was really kind of a crappy experience for the customer. We didn't have a good front end or whatever. So we were able to do it, but it was a lot of manual processes on the back end. So we had spreadsheets and things like that, PSA software. And so we could do it, we just couldn't scale it very well, and it took us forever. So if we wanted to do like a network as a service quote as an example, it would still take us a couple of weeks because we had to go build that thing manually, and then we had to go apply the financing rates and tie it all together and wrap it all into a subscription model. And so once we got to the proposal, it actually looked good in front of the customer. But again, there was no end user self-service and things like that. And that's really where I was frustrated, because I wanted to have the end user self-service. And going into 2020, we were running this MSP business and having really good success with the model, even though the processes on the back end sucked.
Even though it was painful.
It was painful. And we were building software, and we had an idea of what we wanted to be able to build, but I didn't want to invest the money into software. And so going into the kind of money it was going to take to build essentially the infrastructure. So going into 2020, we were an MSP and a software business, if you will, run together. Fortunately or unfortunately, we had a lot of customers in the retail space, and we had gotten really good success with some retailers with the as-a-service model. And so we were hiring salespeople and really cranking that up, thinking, hey, network as a service is where it's at. We're gonna freaking crush it in 2020. And so we were hiring salespeople and stuff going into 2020. COVID hits, And of course, retail is the first to get just completely smashed because all the business got shut down. So literally some of the customers we were working with went bankrupt within 2 or 3 months. And so all of a sudden our prospects changed overnight. So February, I remember sitting here in thousands of square feet by myself, and everyone else was
We're
at
able to
home.
laugh about it now.
And it was really, really spooky being the only car in the parking lot and a 60,000 square foot building and the only person in the building. That was really, really weird. And then I called our product manager, and I was like, after a couple of days of sitting here, by myself, I was like, we're gonna freaking build it. Like, we're gonna build. Like, I don't know.
I know you just said we have to build it, and I told you that.
I
didn't
told
wanna
you
do it.
3 months ago, there's no way in hell, and that we were idiots if we even attempted it, and we're gonna attempt it. And I don't know how long we can hang on, but we're gonna build until we run out of money. Is basically what I decided. It's like we're gonna go down swinging. But what it really was just this transition into, hey, if we're gonna be, I'm not gonna sit on my hands for 2 or 3 months. Like we're gonna focus on building the infrastructure. And when we come out of COVID, because I wasn't smart enough to think about us being a software company only at the time, I was thinking about us as the MSP coming out of COVID with a network as a service platform that no one had ever seen. And that's really what we were thinking about, was building this as a service system that could take any technology and convert it into an as a service model. And so we really put our heads down, and that year in 2020, we built Central Office, which is what we have today.
So we built that. We're trying to run the MSP business at the same time. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges there.
Yeah.
When did the decision come to say, okay, we're going to have to sell we need to just pick a lane?
Yeah. Well, it came very quickly because what ended up happening is we built this platform, and I was able to demo it for other people, including some big distributors and our financial partners, the banking folks, and also we have a lot of relationship to other CEOs of other VARs MSPs because we've been around for a long time. And so I showed it to a couple, several people that I know that were acquaintances at the time. Now they're close friends, and they all kind of said, "Hey, we want that too." And I'm like, oh, okay. But it was obvious that we couldn't compete with them essentially as an MSP and then also be the ones that's providing software to them. And if we're going to build this infrastructure that solves the problem for the industry, we can't also run this other company. And so one of the companies that we were working with ended up acquiring the MSP business. And we closed that transaction in 2021 to really let us focus on building the software platform and being a software company only.
What was the experience like selling the MSP? That
it was bittersweet. It's bittersweet. It's still, it was definitely weird because, I had customers that we supported for 15 years and going in and saying, hey, we're no longer doing this business anymore. It was a very, very interesting transition, but I've been so excited on the platform that we're building. And really what I think the whole time that I was running the MSP and the VAR business, I really prided myself on, hey, we're solving solutions for the customers. And we wanted to go in and be relatively vendor agnostic and listen to the customer's problems and then be able to solve those problems with the infrastructure we're building. But the downside to being in that business is I couldn't really impact the product that we were providing. I was really taking other people's products and then packaging those together, for the business customer that's consuming from our company. What I love about having a software company is that we get to build the stuff.
Right.
And because we had 15 years of experience running the company, we had a 15-year R&D project, and we were the R&D. And so we know how broken and fragmented the systems are. And there's no way, when we decided to build the platform, I thought to myself, there's no way that anybody there's a very low probability that a software company from outside the industry could come and just like solve this problem. And if you look at ConnectWise as an example, the reason that Arnie Bellini was so successful building ConnectWise is because he built an MSP. And then he used that experience to build ConnectWise, and that became the industry platform for 20 plus years now. That's what people are using. And so you can't just have software expertise. You actually have to have the business knowledge and then be able to apply that and then solve the problems. And what I love about the position we're in now is we've got that experience. And so when we're going into a $200 million VAR or a $1 billion VAR or 20 million. We don't, we know like a lot of kind of how those workflows happen, and we're able to solve those problems.
Even all the way down to, because we were
Yeah,
the three-man shop.
exactly.
Three-person
All the way
shop.
down to the 3-person shop. Exactly. We did that too.
And I just want to touch on it. When we sold the MSP, how much impact did growing a recurring revenue part of our business, how much impact did that have on the sale?
Well, I think any MSP that gets sold, it's typically sold as a multiple of recurring revenue. And so that's really impacted the way we were able to sell the business. And every MSP out there is going to know that your multiple is much higher in recurring revenue than essentially one-time revenue. One-time revenue and product resell has a very low value, and then recurring revenue and things like that have a very high value. And so we were able to take advantage of that when we sold the MSP.
So that leads us up to 2021. We sell off the MSP, and now seemingly overnight, even though it wasn't overnight, things that always seem like they're overnight, it's never overnight.
I don't know. Everything never seems like it was overnight.
Well, you just see somebody come out, right? And all of a sudden,
oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
It's like, well,
totally.
It's actually been 10 years of of development and struggling and whatnot.
That's actually a really good point.
We're TechGrid.
Yeah.
So TechGrid launches 2021. Tell me about TechGrid. What is TechGrid?
Well, it's the infrastructure that we created to convert technology into utility that's become TechGrid. And what we realized from being in the industry for so long is that there's got to be a platform that makes it easy to connect a business customer that wants to consume technology to buy from a VAR MSP, and then that MSP provided essentially like utility in an as-a-service model or usage-based model. And in order to do that, you have to connect the customer to the MSP and the VAR, and that company to all the partners, and that entire kind of infrastructure has to be digitally. So what TechGrid is it's how we re-envisioned all that kind of taking place, where the original software for the industry was designed to move product, the PSA software was designed to move essentially services. All that has to be embedded together, and then we have to add all the other things like internet and apps into essentially that software. And then you have to have workflow software that can deliver that to a customer in a modern way.
Right. And so TechGrid's a platform. Can you explain a little bit the difference between why being a platform is so important versus maybe something like an all-in-one type solution?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of people worked on all-in-one software. And I would argue that's what PSA software is. You typically have a little bit of CRM functionality, you have a little bit of ITSM, you can do invoicing from it, you do a little bit of project management, and you have all these kind of different tools together, time tracking, things like that. And the challenge with that is a lot of those individual modules might just be average on a functionality perspective. So what we ended up happening when we tried to use professional services automation software is we wanted HubSpot CRM because the CRM kind of sucked in the PSA, and we really wanted to have HubSpot be the CRM, but we still wanted the ITSM functionality happening inside PSA software. And so the problem with kind of the all-in-one approach to software building is that there's going to be all these point solutions that come out that are going to be better, way better than what you can build here. And if you go inside an MSP, they've got 30 tools that they're using for different things. And so the modern approach, I would argue, is more of a platform style approach where you're making it easy to plug things in. So all-in-one software is one way. Shopify is kind of the opposite in the spectrum, where in Shopify, they built a commerce platform. And so they still had to say, what's the core functionality that our platform is going to provide? In their instance, it's, I'm going to build a commerce platform for merchants who want to sell to customers. And they did really good on this core functionality. And then all the other things like, hey, I want to have a CRM. Okay, I can plug in HubSpot. Hey, I want to have email marketing. I can, plug in that. And so if you look at Shopify, they've got 10,000 apps in the App Store that work interchangeably on top of their commerce platform. And so if you go and look at somebody that's using Shopify, they're using Shopify, but they also have 10 to 30 apps that's integrated on top of Shopify. That type of platform thinking is what we believe the MSP and the VAR industry, like what the IT channel needs, is it needs a commerce type of functionality built around the workflows of the IT channel, and then all the other things that are interchangeable can be added on as apps.
Right. So how is TechGrid solving that back end, front end problem?
Well, back to the story when we were building, what we figured out we have to build first is we've got to build it in microservices. The architecture to be microservices oriented and API first. And so actually the first thing that we started working on is how do we digitally connect, the big distributors like Ingram Micro and TD SYNNEX and all these companies that the MSP is working on or wants to work with. How do we just digitally connect all these companies together? And then we said, okay, well, it's not enough just to digitize the connection to the partners. We also have to digitize the activity to the apps, because I might want to use HubSpot or Salesforce CRM, but then I might want to use, QuickBooks or Sage or something else for accounting. And so I have to first connect all these different systems together before I can do anything else. And so the API kind of first framework was what we built out of the gate.
Right. So an MSP is going to come in, they're going to be able to start quoting.
Yep.
Right. And now we go into procurement as well, because I think there's a lot of solutions out there that are for quoting.
Yeah.
Or at least generating quotes, maybe even proposals.
Yep.
Right. But TechGrid is trying to solve the procurement issue as well.
Well, okay, so holistically, like what the problems that we have to solve is how do we digitally sell and how do we digitally fulfill? And you cannot separate those two things. You cannot separate those things. A lot of the industry software today, whether it's CPQ software or whatever, is being plugged in into existing systems that have limited functionality. And so they're trying to say, hey, I'm just going to solve the CPQ problem, and then the existing software is going to do procurement and fulfillment and all that. And the problem with that is a lot of the existing software isn't able to digitally fulfill stuff. And if you just said, it doesn't work well, and it doesn't work well, then you would say, I'm going to take a different approach. I'm going to provide digital sales and fulfillment, and then everything else is going to attach on top of that, more like a Shopify style platform. And so what we believe strongly, strong enough to build it, is that you have to have digital sales and fulfillment. And that's essentially, I need workflows for selling any sort of IT technology, and then I need workflows for fulfilling any sort of technology. And so basic things like an order management system. You and I log into Amazon and we have access to Amazon's order management system, and it shows us where our toilet paper is, where our dog food is, right? All that shows up there. That same functionality of an OMS, an order management system, needs to exist for the IT industry. So if a customer is buying, let's say it's an assessment from me, well, they need an order management system that shows them the real-time status of their assessment. And those are the types of things that we decided needed to be tackled.
We mentioned at the beginning, you went through a Series A round.
Yeah.
Right? Yep. With Bellini Capital, which is Arnie Bellini.
Yeah.
How'd you meet Arnie? And, why do you think he chose to back TechGrid?
I met Arnie at a trade show, and he was a speaker, and we met getting coffee at the coffee bar. And my perception, I actually had never met him before. My perception was that, Arnie sold his company for a lot of money. He's probably disconnected from the industry. This guy's been gone for 5 years. He's probably floating around on a yacht somewhere, right. And probably not very engaged. And and that could not be further from the truth. Arnie's very engaged in what's going on in the industry. And I think he thought, hey, I left the industry 5 years ago, and there hasn't been a tremendous amount of innovation. And so we have to kind of rethink the tech stack. So what was really interesting about Arnie is a lot of things that were coming out of his mouth when we met were things that we were building. And so when he would go, hey, we need to modernize like the architecture and microservices and how all this works, I was like, yeah, let me show you that, And so this is what we built. And so it was just kind of this like natural match where he and I hit it off, immediately. And so it was a no-brainer for us. And to be able to work with an industry pioneer, like him, because he literally was one of the guys that created the entire industry, has just been a pleasure.
Right. That kind of went into, I was going to say, because obviously we kind of talked about it before. Outside of this which was, you can take, funding from anybody.
Yeah.
But there's a difference when you actually get a funding round from somebody that really has a lot to provide in terms of experience.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about him is he built it all before. He's done it all before. So a lot of things that we've gone through or are going through, and you're changing workflows inside companies. He's had experience with all that. Literally, he was the guy that built the first workflows. And so, yeah, it's been just a tremendous learning experience being able to work with him, talk to him about almost everything from product pricing to roadmap to,
Right.
how we get people to adopt the software, to which partners we should use. He's been, in addition to adding, capital, which is really important to allow us to build, he also adds credibility and then experience.
Right. So, and that takes us up to today. So when you reflect on the last 20 years or so, what do you think you've learned about running an MSP and then now obviously a software company? What's that?
I wouldn't have enough time in the podcast to talk about to answer all that. There's just so many things that I've learned. So just like on a personal level, the importance of self-development, I think, is just important. And internally, we always talk about, this concept of being an infinite learner. And I think if you're working in technology specifically, you never stop learning. It's not like, I'm going to do this job. The job's never going to change. No, you're in an industry where literally your job should be changing. And when you're running a company, as a CEO or, and I've been fortunate enough to have literally every job inside the company almost. And get fired from some of them from my own team.
You might not be doing field services.
Yeah, I'm not allowed to do. There's some things I'm not allowed to do anymore because I was told I was not allowed to. There's definitely some of that. But no, what happens as you're running a company is your job changes a lot, and so learning like product development and learning how to ramp up sales and marketing, all these things you have to learn, how to raise capital. I never had any experience doing that. There's just so much that you end up learning and developing personally. But what I encourage everybody inside any company, regardless of whether it's technology or not, is just adopt this mindset of always be learning. And then you'll be able to grow in different things. People are like, how did you not have a college degree and study youth ministry and then run a tech company? I'm like, well, I read books.
A lot of books.
I don't know what else to tell you. I read and I learn. That's how.
Definitely something we've gotten here since my time, at least. Is, there's not a shortage of new opportunities.
Yep.
To plug yourself in and challenge yourself.
Right.
Which comes with a lot of great. On the other side of that is you can build yourself up into this better version than you ever thought you could be.
That's right.
Which is really cool. So what can we expect from TechGrid in 2025?
We're releasing a lot of different features around selling and fulfilling. We've been doing this for quite some time where we've been working with a lot of large VARs and MSPs on the roadmap. And so one of the things that's really cool about what we're able to do is get direct feedback from our customers, which is the IT channel, and then build tools that enable things for them. And so I think there's a lot of people talking about AI and how they automate things. And what I think people are missing is AI standalone is useful. Like I can create an agent to do certain things, maybe even write a statement of work, for example. But if you take AI and apply it to a digital workflow, that's game changing. That's completely different. And in our industry, there's not good workflow software that's digitizing things. And so what we want to think about first is, how do we digitize our workflows when we're running a company? And then what's all the cool shit we can do or even automate for our team and for our customers that are adding AI on top of that? And if you heard Bezos talking at some of his recent meetings, that he's always on TV talking about something, but they're talking about how they're applying AI to literally every part of the business. And I think that's actually the opportunity for the MSPs in the VAR community. So how do I digitize it and then literally apply AI to every part of the company? And then what does that do for my operational efficiency? What does that do for my customer experience when I'm able to do that? How much more profitable am I going to be when I can actually have an agent that's doing a lot of my quoting for me, or doing a lot of my support tickets, or, those are all great opportunities that I think you're going to see in 2025.
Awesome, man. Thanks, Phil, for joining us, telling us your story today. It was awesome getting to sit down and chop it up with you, buddy.
Thanks for having me, Danny.
Yeah.